Hi, everybody. Friends, it's nice to see everybody. I'm John Cavadini, Director of the Institute for Church Life, and on behalf of the Institute, pleased to welcome everybody to this second keynote speech in our conference. Friends, at this time I'm going to recognize Professor Dan Philpott, Associate Professor of Political Science and a Fellow at the Kroc Institute, who's going to introduce our speaker for this evening.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. If you're like me, you receive far more emails than you can possibly read. In my ambitious moments, I find myself signing up for this or that listserv or tantalizing e-newsletter, only to find my inbox filled up with far more messages than I can possibly handle. But one email that I rarely fail to read is the weekly column of John Allen. And so, in fact, I'm kind of frustrated because you've made my productivity decline so much. Because when your email appears, I click, and 10 or 15 minutes of my time is out the window because I'm riveted to the screen, astonished at the ability of one man to dig up so many interesting stories. Refreshingly, John Allen has no axe to grind or ideology to promote. His columns raise my fascination, not my blood pressure. He's not predictable. Towards the church, he is sympathetic, but not a sycophant, one who exercises a critical and measured eye out of an underlying love. He is universally admired, and from people across the spectrum. Papal biographer George Weigel called him the best Anglophone Vatican reporter ever. When Allen was called upon to put the first question to Pope Benedict XVI aboard the papal plane en route to the United States in April 2008, the Vatican spokesperson said to the Pope, "Holy Father, this man needs no introduction." Kenneth Woodward of Newsweek, who has been writing about the church for decades, described Allen as the journalist other reporters, and not a few cardinals, look to for the inside story on how all the Pope's men direct the world's largest church. So Bishop Rhodes, here's your inside source. Andrew Greeley, the late Richard John Newhouse, and the London Tablet have spoken of him in similar superlative tones. John Allen is the author of 7 best-selling books on the Vatican and Catholic affairs, writes regular columns for the National Catholic Reporter, is senior Vatican analyst for CNN, and writes frequently about the church for national and international publications. His latest book is People of Hope, an extended interview with Archbishop Timothy Dolan in New York. But as one who cares about and writes a bit of my own on religious freedom, the thing I appreciate most about John Allen is his courageous and at first lonely crusade for the cause of persecuted Christians. Relentlessly and passionately, he has written column after column aimed at rousing Catholics and other Christians from indifference towards their many, and there are many, brothers and sisters who are dying for their faith, calling for a solidarity that is compassionate and constructive, but also uncompromising. Well, at this point, it's time to let him tell the story. So join me in welcoming John Allen.
Hello there. Can everyone hear? Excellent. Dan, thank you for that gracious introduction. In fact, it was so fulsome, I feel a little chagrined and embarrassed, and therefore compelled to make a confession. The confession is this: while it is technically true, as Dan just told you, that I am the senior Vatican analyst at CNN, before you get terribly impressed by that, there's something else you should know, which is that I am also the only Vatican analyst at CNN. So I'm senior in a universe of one. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what commercial television does. Rather than giving you more money, they give you ever loftier titles. It's a bit like the Academy in that regard, or bishops, forgive me, the Catholic Church. But in any event, here we are. And I know it's sort of pro forma for speakers to start by saying how delighted they are to be someplace. But please believe me when I tell you, that tonight I really mean it. I am not only delighted, but I am thrilled and humbled and moved and edified and consoled to be here because, as Dan said, I have over the last couple of years been doing whatever I can to try to raise consciousness about the issue of the new Christian martyrs of our time. And it has at times been a frustrating and lonely exercise. And so to be in a group of people, to be with a group of people who so clearly get it, who in fact get it much better than I do, I cannot tell you the kind of affirming power that the 24 hours I've spent in your company has had. So thank you all for that from the bottom of my heart. In fact, I have to say, as I was just reflecting a few moments ago about what it's meant to me to be with you today, I tripped over a memory from 2009, and this may seem a little off topic, but stick with me because this will help express the spirit that I'm bringing to tonight's presentation. In 2009, Pope Benedict XVI traveled to the Holy Land. We went to Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian territories. And one of the items on his itinerary in Israel was to visit the Western Wall, of course, the ancient temple. And it was sort of a homage to that iconic moment in the year 2000, the Great Jubilee year, when John Paul II went to the Western Wall and left behind that handwritten note apologizing for centuries of Christian anti-Semitism, which you can now see preserved under glass in Yad Vashem. But in any event, Benedict wanted to sort of recall that moment, so he went to the Western Wall too. I was in the press pool that morning. I don't know how many of you have ever been to the Western Wall. But on a normal day, let me tell you, the security there is pretty thick. Let me just try to express it to you this way. On an ordinary day, getting into the Western Wall makes getting into the White House feel like going to the 7-Eleven for a quart of milk. Okay? I kid you not. And that's a normal day. You can imagine the day the Pope is going to be there, right? So those of us in the press pool had to get there about 4 hours early. And it took us about 3 hours to navigate the screening and the body checks and all of this stuff. But finally, we were into the courtyard in front of the Western Wall. I think it was me, a Frenchman, a couple of Italians, a Spaniard, something like that. Well, a German, of course, because we have a German Pope, so they're all over this story. So we were standing there, waiting for things to get started, and there was a group of rabbis that were finishing their morning prayers that were being escorted out. We had a little assistant from the Israeli communications ministry who was with us, and he turns to me and he says, "Hey, I know one of those rabbis. He's an American. Would you like to meet him?" I said, "Well, sure. I have nothing better to do for the next hour, so sure." So he brings him over. We're introduced. And to sort of get the conversation started, I said, "Well, listen, just tell me your story. Tell me your story." So he told me that he had been born and raised in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, moved to Israel in 1967 at the time of the war. He now leads a small Orthodox congregation in the Old Quarter of Jerusalem. And he told me that every day since that time in 1967 that he moved, every day, 365 days a year, rain or shine, he gets out of bed at 6 o'clock in the morning and goes to the Western Wall to pray for peace. And I was just flabbergasted. I said, "Look, I don't know if that is the ultimate infidelity or the triumph of hope over experience or what to make of it. But think about the irony of this. You're going to this spot every day to pray for peace on the least peaceful piece of real estate on the face of the planet, right? Because not only do you have the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? But in the Jewish world, you've got the conflict between religious and secular Jews. In the Palestinian world, you've got the conflict between Hamas and Fatah. In the Christian world in the Holy Land, for God's sake, you look around, often what you see is that we're at one another's throats. Bear in mind, this was a year to the day after the famous brawl at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Do you all know this story? Great story. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, one of the most precious sites on the Christian map, is under the joint administration of 6 different Christian churches. So you got the Catholics, the Armenians, the Ethiopians, the Copts, the Syrians, the Greek Orthodox. I think that's the list, okay? And each of these 6 churches has a monk there all the time who is assigned to look after their interests. And they sit on the roof of the church in these kind of ratty lawn chairs in spots that have been hallowed by centuries of tradition. Okay? So this is one hot, sunny day in 2008. One of these guys, I think it was the Ethiopian, decided he was going to move his chair 10 feet to the left because he wanted to sit in the shade. Okay? The Armenian interpreted this as a land grab and told him to get the hell back where he was supposed to be. The Ethiopian was not in the mood. He took a swing. The Armenian returned fire. Suddenly, all 6 of these monks are mixing it up. The people down in the courtyard get wind of what's going on. They get in on the act. Eventually, the Israeli Defense Forces have to be called in to separate these people. 11 were hospitalized. Ladies and gentlemen, they will know we are Christians by the size of our brawls. Okay? So anyway, looking at all that, I said to this rabbi, look, man, I got to know. Okay, I mean, when you look around, all you see is conflict and violence and discord, and yet here you are at the Western Wall every day praying for peace. How does that make you feel? Okay. And the rabbi looked at me and he said, how does it make me feel? Like I'm talking to a wall. I suspect he had used that line before, okay? It just rolled out a little too naturally. But in any event, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm trying to express to you by telling you this story is that when I am with you, people who are so profoundly convinced as I am of the importance of telling this story, I do not feel like I'm talking to a wall. Okay? Now, I confess I also had an ulterior motive for beginning that way. I wanted to get at least one punchline in before we get underway, because unfortunately, the story we have to tell tonight is no laughing matter, really. Instead, it is the story of what I've come to call the global war on Christians. Global war on Christians. We are talking, in my opinion, about the most dramatic, most compelling, most urgent Christian narrative of our time. The story, I'm convinced that 200 years from now, when historians look back at Christian life in our generation, this is going to be the chapter that looms largest for them in terms of the drama of what was happening in our time. Because what we are seeing in the early 21st century, as the slide indicates, is the rise of an entire new generation of Christian martyrs. The picture you see on this slide is from a memorial to the victims of the siege of the Basilica of Our Lady of Salvation in Baghdad in October 2010. We'll come back to that later on in the presentation. What I want to suggest at the outset is that not only is this the most dramatic Christian story of our time, it is also by far the most underreported and untold Christian story of our time. Now, I think there are many reasons for that. Some of it has to do with the kind of myopia of Western conversation, particularly American conversation, and particularly when it's election season. As you know, in my business, we are now all race for the White House all the time. Okay? It has to do with the fact that the panoply, the galaxy of new Christian martyrs embrace a staggering variety and complexity of situations. I think there's another reason as well, and I think it was captured by Régis Debray, who is a very well-known French intellectual, he's a veteran leftist. He fought alongside Che Guevara in Bolivia and so on. Anyway, Debray makes the point, as you can see on the slide, that anti-Christian persecution falls smack in the middle of the ideological blind spot of the West. Okay? Because these victims are too Christians to excite the left, and they are too foreign to interest the right. In other words, there is no natural constituency, no natural carrier in Western conversation for the plight of suffering Christians around the world. Okay? And again, a profound note of gratitude from me and far more importantly from those who are suffering in various parts of the world that you all are involved in the urgent project of trying to break that silence. So let me give you the game plan, my game plan here tonight. First, I'm going to give you a very brief statistical overview of the realities of Christian martyrdom in our time. Those of you who have been with us all day throughout the conference, this is not going to be anything new, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Then I'm going to give you 4 dispatches from the front lines. That is, 4 examples of the combat zones in this global war on Christians, which I hope will put flesh and sort of a human face on the statistics and the kind of overview. Then I'm going to try to puncture 5 persistent myths about anti-Christian persecution. And then I'm going to end with some thoughts about what we can do about it, and at that stage, we'll bring this plane in for a landing. Okay? So first, the overview. These, ladies and gentlemen, are the facts of our time. And when I say facts, I mean it. I mean not hunches, not theories, not conjecture, not the overheated artifacts of someone's imagination, but hard empirical realities about the early 21st century. First fact comes to us from the International Society for Human Rights, which is a secular NGO, not a church outfit, a secular NGO based in Frankfurt, Germany, that tracks human rights issues. Their estimate is that 80%, that is 80% of the acts of religious discrimination in this world are directed against Christians. Fact, Christians are by far, by some order of magnitude, statistically speaking, the most persecuted religious body on the planet. Okay? Fact one. Fact two, as we heard this morning from the Pew Forum, again, not a church outfit, probably the most widely respected think tank on the intersection of religion and public policy in D.C. Their assessment is that Christians face some form of harassment, either de jure or de facto, that is either according to the law of the land or just the social realities of the neighborhood they live in, face some form of harassment in a staggering total of 133 countries. That's 67% of the countries on earth, 67% of the 193 states recognized by the United Nations. Okay? Very few places on this earth where you can be a Christian and feel completely safe. Okay? And in the most bone-chilling estimate of all, in my opinion, Aid to the Church in Need, widely respected Catholic humanitarian group based in Germany but global in its reach, their estimate is that in the 21st century, annually 150,000 Christians are killed. 150,000 Christians lose their life either out of hatred for the faith or hatred for the virtues and works of charity inspired by the faith. Now, of course, we heard Todd Johnson this morning was a slightly different estimate. His estimate for the decade from 2001 to 2010 is we're 100,000 a year. But let's even take that low-end estimate. If we're talking 100 instead of 150,000, what does that mean in concrete? What that means in concrete is that in the hour we are going to be together here tonight, ladies and gentlemen, somewhere on this planet, 11 Christians are losing their lives. 11 people are going to be dying in the time that we are talking about their plight in this room here this evening. I want you to keep that number in your mind and in your heart, okay? Because it is not only astonishing, I would suggest, it is also obscene. Okay? That's the big picture. Let's sort of drill down and increase the focus and look at some specific situations around the world that sort of lend flesh and blood and life to this narrative. We'll begin our brief tour in Iraq because, in my opinion, it is perhaps the single most harrowing example of the broad realities we've been discussing in this conference. In 1991, at the time of the first U.S.-led Gulf War in Iraq, the estimate was that there were 1.5 to 2 million Christians living in Iraq, mostly Chaldean Orthodox, but also a sizable Chaldean Catholic population. It was one of the most flourishing and sizable Christian populations anywhere in the Middle East. And of course, it's a church that can trace its roots back to the era of the apostles. Okay? Today, the high-end estimate for the number of Christians left in Iraq is around 450,000. Realistically, most people believe it's closer to 200 or 250,000. Bottom line is that a church that took 2 millennia to construct has been gutted, essentially, in the arc of 2 decades. There are now more Chaldean Christians living in refugee camps in Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon than are left in Iraq. There are more Chaldean Catholics living in the suburbs of Detroit than are left in Baghdad. Okay, these are the realities. Now, the vast majority of these people have gone into exile. They've fled the chaos and the insecurity and the violence and the rising tide of Islamic fundamentalism in Iraq, but many of them have been killed. Now, it's one thing to say that. It's another thing to hear one of the stories. Let me tell you one of the stories. It's what happened at the cathedral, the Chaldean Cathedral of Our Lady of Salvation in Baghdad on October 31st, 2010. Of course, we just celebrated the 2-year anniversary. Now, in itself, the fact that the church was bombed that day is unfortunately no novelty. Of the 63 Christian churches in Iraq, 40 of them have been bombed at least once since April 2003, the beginning of the Second Gulf War. But what followed was unusual, because what followed was that armed gunmen stormed the church. They shot the priest who was celebrating Mass. They shot the 2 deacons who were assisting him. They shot 33 other people, leaving 36 dead. And they held the church for 6 hours until the Iraqi Defense Forces arrived to liberate it. Now, shortly after all this happened, I had the opportunity to interview one of the survivors. It's a young Chaldean Catholic woman by the name of Fatima. who now lives in Rome. She left Iraq. She told me that she was singing in the choir that day. The choir mate to her right and the choir mate to her left were both shot dead. The way she survived is by getting on the floor and pulling their bodies over her and playing dead for the agonizing 6 hours it took for someone to come to her rescue, thinking every second of those 6 hours that somebody was going to come by and deliver the coup de grace. Now, as I say, Fatima has left Iraq. She's moved to Rome. She has dedicated her every waking moment to helping her fellow Christians get out of Iraq because she is profoundly convinced they don't have a future there. Now, one hopes she's wrong, of course, but it is impossible to fault the experience that has led her to that conclusion. Okay? I want to add one other note. It seems to me that we American Catholics face a special historical and moral obligation to be concerned with the fate of the church in Iraq. Now, as Catholics, of course, we profess to be members of a communion of saints that transcends time and space, where the suffering of any member of the body is our suffering too. That's our theology and our ecclesiology. As Americans, it is indisputable that we bear a special responsibility for the situation in which those Christians in Iraq today find themselves. And this is quite apart from whatever moral judgment you want to reach about the two wars. That's a legitimate conversation to have, and there's a right of citizenship to points of view on all sides. But what is empirically certain is that it was those two interventions that ripped the lid off sectarian tensions in Iraq and created a context in which Christians are walking around with a bullseye on their backs. Okay? I would submit to you, given those two realities, given what we profess as Catholics, and given the responsibility we bear as Americans, the fact that the situation facing the church in Iraq is not a get out of bed in the morning thinking about it, front burner, top of the brain concern for the Catholic Church in the United States is nothing less than a moral scandal. And I don't use this language lightly. I'm not the kind of guy who finds a scandal lurking under every rock. But I'm telling you, in this case, our failure to apply our last best efforts to meaningful gestures of solidarity with our suffering sisters and brothers in Iraq is quite simply inexcusable. And let me say this. If we had spent over the last 20 years 1/10 of the amount of time and treasure we invested in debating whether to say "and also with you" versus "and with your spirit" at Mass, and this is no prejudice to the New Translation, I'm actually a fan of the New Translation, but I'm telling you, if we had invested 1/10 of the time and treasure we invested in that debate in trying to come to the rescue of our sisters and brothers in Iraq, ladies and gentlemen, we could change the world. We could change the world. Okay? All right, that's our first stop. Our second is India. And I wanted to include India. We'll get to the myth that anti-Christian persecution is exclusively a product of Islamic radicalism in a moment. But India is a particularly compelling example of threats that come from another quarter. In this case, it's not Islamic radicalism. It is most often the rise of Hindu radicalism. And by the way, with India's emergence as a global superpower, with the growth of a very large and wealthy Indian diaspora in many different parts of the world, not just in the Indian subcontinent, my prediction, and if this happens, remember you heard it here first. If it doesn't happen, please forget I'm about to say this. Okay? But my prediction would be that by the middle of this century, we will think about Hindu radicalism the same way we think about Islamic radicalism today. That is, a tremendously compelling, destabilizing force in global affairs that we have to address. Okay? Given the rise of Hindu radicalism, and it's not universally distributed across the country, there are certain hot zones in India where this tends to be most intense. But it means that assaults on clergy and churches and worship services and so forth have become routine. In fact, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Asian News Service. It's a Catholic news portal that does a fantastic job of documenting threats to Christians in various parts of the world. If you get their email deliveries, rarely does a day go by without another story of some form of anti-persecution taking place in India. It has become so routine that we don't even blink at it anymore. I mean, it's become part of just the sort of ordinary course of business. India has the dubious claim to fame of being the site of the single most violent anti-Christian pogrom of the last decade. It took place in the northeastern state of Orissa in 2008, when a mob that had been whipped up by a group of Hindu radicals set fire to Christian churches, set fire to Christian schools, looted Christian-owned businesses, drove Christians from their homes. This unfolded over several days. By the time it was all over, 100 people were dead, and an estimated 50,000 Christians had taken refuge in a forest where they remained for weeks before they felt safe enough to return to their homes. Now, there are a lot of compelling stories there from that pogrom, but I think perhaps the most heart-wrenching would be the so-called widows of Orissa. These are a group of about a couple dozen women who lost their husbands in this violence. Because new converts to Christianity in India tend to come disproportionately from the Dalit group and the tribal underclass, these women are often seen as not being good marriage prospects. They tend to be illiterate and economically vulnerable. They are tremendously at risk, okay, because of what happened to them. Now, of all places, in Greensville, South Carolina, there's a woman by the name of Rita Laravi, who is an Indian immigrant to the United States, who heard about these widows of Orissa. And she created the sort of classic micro-charity initiative. Basically, her idea is to try to scrounge up enough money every year to buy, for these roughly 40 women, to buy them each a goat and some seed so they can have milk and crops for their families. Now, that may not sound like very much to you, but if the alternative is starvation, it certainly beats that. Okay? That's the reality that some Christians in India today are facing. Third stop will be Syria. If you want a spot in the global map where right now, today, November 5th, 2012, Christians are arguably at the greatest risk, you could make a very compelling case that it's Syria. There is a profound fear among the Christian community of Syria. And let's say this, there are 2.3 million Christians in Syria. That's 10% of the national population. It's the second largest Christian community in the Middle East after the 10 million Copts in Egypt. So it's a sizable and historically important Christian community. Both at the top and the bottom of the Christian community in Syria, there is a deep and pervasive fear that they are going to be the next rock. That is, they're next in line. They are going to be the next Christian church that becomes the primary target after the fall of a police state, after chaos is unleashed. And they are convinced that 10 years from now, their church is going to be in shambles, just as the Church of Iraq is today. You know, the Christian leaders in Syria have been criticized in some corners of the West for being unacceptably soft on Assad. And look, I'm not here to make any apologies. I mean, Assad is a thug. But if you live in that neighborhood and you're a Christian, I'm telling you, the choice you perceive is not between a police state and a fully functioning democracy. The choice you perceive is between a police state and annihilation. Okay? That's the landscape that they're looking at. Now, what makes things particularly difficult and complicated in terms of trying to help the Christians in Syria is that they're not concentrated in one sort of Christian ghetto. They're actually spread across the country. The Greek Orthodox, who are the majority tradition, are concentrated in and around Damascus, which means they're in territory still controlled by the Assad regime. The Syriacs are up to the east of the Euphrates River, near the border with Turkey, basically in a Kurdish-controlled zone that's functionally autonomous. The Catholics and the Armenians live in the areas around Aleppo and Homs, which is the scenes of the most intense fighting. So they would be the Christians in Syria today who are most at risk. Tens of thousands of these folks have fled. However, they are not doing what the other refugees in Syria are doing, which is heading for the refugee camps in Jordan and Turkey, because the Christians believe that if they were to go to those refugee camps, which they perceive to be under the control of Hamas and Hezbollah, they would be at even greater risk. So instead, they're heading across the border into Lebanon or into the south of Syria, taking refuge with friends, relatives, private homes, depending on the kindness of strangers, which means because they're not in these big refugee camps, they're not being reached by the UN, they're not being reached by NGOs, they are completely vulnerable. There is tremendous fear that these folks are going to be running out of food and water and clothing and heating oil over what is a fairly brutal winter in Syria. And so the Christian martyrs who are being directly killed as a result of the fighting in Syria, their numbers may be multiplied by others who are dying because of the pathology of displacement. Okay? That's the reality in Syria. Our final stop will be in the Congo. The two Congo wars of the late 90s into the first part of this century would undoubtedly be the candidate for the most ignored, most overlooked, most untold world war in human history. You're talking about a conflict that at one stage involved troops from 8 nations and about 25 armed groups. You're talking about a conflict that left 5.4 million people dead. 5.4 million. Okay, if this conflict had been taking place in Europe or North America, it would be considered the pivotal chapter of late 20th century history. Okay, the fact that it happened in Africa, on the other hand, means that it's a footnote to most stories of our time. Now, we talked this morning about how do you identify how many of these people who died as a result of this violence, how many are actually martyrs? And that's a question that we're going to have to sort through and try to get our minds around. But there is no question that whatever the eventual number is, it's legion. It's legion. And the reason for it is because in the most acute zones of the violence in the Congo wars, when violence would break out someplace, typically what would happen is that as the early temblors of an outbreak would begin to be felt, other institutions would bug out. Okay, so the UN would take off. The government would leave. The army would withdraw. NGOs would flee for safety. Okay? The only institution, typically, that had boots on the ground when the fighting was at its bloodiest peak in these combat zones was the Catholic Church, because both at the top and the bottom, the leaders of the church were determined that they were not going to abandon people who were standing in harm's way. And many, countless, hundreds of thousands of them lost their lives as a result of that choice. Briefly, I'm going to tell you the story of one, Archbishop Christoph Munzahirwa, who was, as you can see, killed on October 29th, 1996, which means we just celebrated the 16th anniversary of his martyrdom. Archbishop Christoph was a Jesuit. I'd had the opportunity to meet him in Rome. He was at the 94th Synod for Africa, so I'd interviewed him and knew him a little bit. An incredibly bright, charismatic, deeply pastoral man. In 96, what was happening as the Mobutu government was on its last legs in Zaire, which of course then became the Congo, Rwandan troops were pouring across the border into the eastern zone. He was the Archbishop of Bukavu in eastern Congo. Rwandan troops were pouring across the border. These were mostly Tutsis who blamed Mobutu for harboring Hutu militants. So these Tutsis were killing any Hutu they could get their hands on, and moderate Tutsis, and pretty much anyone else who got in their way. Okay. Archbishop Christoph got notice on the 25th of October that they would be arriving in Bukavu within 24 to 48 hours. Okay. On the 28th, day before his death, he went on the only radio station in the area that was still working to issue a fervent appeal for international help, pleading, begging the cri de coeur for someone in the international community to come to the rescue of his people. And of course, as we all know, it didn't happen. Instead, 24 hours later, death came for the archbishop. What happened is the Rwandan troops pulled into the central square of Bukavu, where Archbishop Christoph was standing, arms outstretched, begging with them not to kill his people. They shot him 6 times and left his body in the square for 24 hours as a warning to anyone else. This is what happens if you get in our way. When his brothers were finally able to collect his body and celebrate a funeral mass, someone, the homilist, quoted one of Archbishop Christoph's favorite sayings, which seems poetically appropriate for his story. The saying was, "There are some things that can be seen only with eyes that have cried." There are some things that can be seen only with eyes that have cried. And if ever there was a story that makes the point, I think it's the story of Archbishop Christoph and the thousands, hundreds of thousands, potentially a million or more Congolese martyrs whose fate he shared. Okay. All right, those are our dispatches from the front lines. Let's briefly try to tackle 5 persistent myths about anti-Christian persecution, and then we'll be done. I'll try to step through this material quickly. First myth is that Christians are at risk only where they're a minority. For example, the Middle East, some parts of Asia. That is, the notion is that only where Christians are a small, embattled flock are they at any risk of losing life and limb? The reality, ladies and gentlemen, is that anywhere a Christian chooses to take a stand in the name of the gospel, they are at risk. Okay? First of all, even if it were true that Christians are vulnerable only where they're a minority, bear in mind there are 200 million Christians in this world who live in regions where they're a minority. That's a substantial group of people. But it quite simply isn't true. And the picture on the slide makes the point. This is one of the new martyrs of 2011, a Catholic laywoman by the name of Mary Elizabeth Macias Castro, who lived in Laredo, Mexico. She was the local head of the Scalabrian lay movement, and she was also a blogger who felt her faith compelled her to expose the activities of the local narco cartels. For her trouble, one of these drug gangs abducted her, killed her, cut her head off, left her body with its head next to it in the central square of Laredo with a sign in cardboard written in her own blood saying, "This is what happens if you mess with us." Okay? Mexico, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is the second most populous Catholic nation on earth. There are 92 million baptized Roman Catholics in Mexico. Okay? If Christians were vulnerable only where they're a minority, then what in the world happened to Mary Elizabeth Castro? Okay? That's myth one. Myth two, that it's all about Islam. That the lone engine of anti-Christian persecution in this world is radical Islam. Now look, make no mistake, statistically speaking, the preponderance of new martyrs in our time, that is, right now today, the preponderance of new martyrs being generated probably in one way, shape, or form are related to the rise of radical Islam. But equally, make no mistake, if somehow tomorrow radical Islam were to disappear, the threats to Christians in this world would hardly be gone. Okay, this is not a magic bullet that's going to make all of our problems dissolve. In fact, what we face is a bewildering cocktail of threats, and the list on this slide is hardly exhaustive. It's simply illustrative. Christians face threats from ultranationalists, for example, in Turkey, totalitarian states. We've already talked about Hindu radicalism, corporations, organized crime, state security policies, and so on. Even including, ladies and gentlemen, believe it or not, Christian radicalism. Picture on this slide is from a village in rural Mexico, village of San Rafael, where a small congregation of Pentecostal Christians were given notice 3 years ago by a group of traditionalist Catholics that they had 48 hours to get out of town or they would be lynched in the central square of the town because, these traditionalist Catholics argued, their presence was an insult to the Catholic identity of Mexico. So let's not make any mistake about it. Yes, radical Islam is a real and present danger, but no, you cannot reduce the global war on Christians exclusively to the threat that comes to us from radical Islam. Third, it only counts as persecution. It's only martyrdom if the motives for killing someone were explicitly religious. Now, as you know, in the Catholic Church, we have a fairly rigorous test for martyrdom. We say for someone to count as a martyr, they have to be killed in odium fidei, in hatred of the faith. Okay? And that, in terms of the spirituality of martyrdom and the canonical process, may make all sense in the world. But the argument I want to make is that in the sense in which you and I are using the term martyr, okay, that is, Christians who are killed either out of hatred for the faith or hatred for the virtues and works of charity inspired by the faith, we need to have a more expanded standard. And I would suggest that that standard ought to be located not on the side of the persecutor, but on the side of the persecutee. Okay? Let me tell you a story that makes the point. The two people you see on the slide were two more of the new martyrs of 2011. This is a Croatian sister by the name of Lucretia Mamek and an Italian lay volunteer by the name of Francesco Bazzani. They were killed in Burundi, in what was the epicenter of the genocide in 1994. Now, they were not killed as some kind of anti-Christian pogrom, okay? I mean, what happened was there was a group of thieves who simply thought that the residence where the sisters lived would be a good place to steal stuff. So they broke into the convent, they shot Sister Lucretia immediately, they kidnapped Bazzani, and then later, when they got involved in a shootout with the cops, they shot him in the back. Now, you could argue they were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tragic, but not martyrdom. I would submit to you we need to go deeper. Okay, the question, I think, the relevant question in our analysis of this case is, what were those two people doing there in the first place? I mean, these were intelligent, cosmopolitan folks. They certainly knew that there were safer pieces of real estate on the planet than being in rural Burundi at the epicenter of the 1994 genocide. They were there because they felt these were the most vulnerable, marginalized, and forgotten people on earth, and their faith compelled them to stand with them. Okay? Let me put this to you in a soundbite, ladies and gentlemen. Let's forget for a moment the technical details of the process of formally declaring someone as a martyr. Let's ask what ought to engage our compassion, our concern, and our activism. And if that's the question, I would submit that the standard should not be what was in the head of the guy pulling the trigger. The standard ought to be what was in the heart of the person getting shot. And by that standard, for my money, Sister Lucretia and Francesco qualify as martyrs, okay, deserving of our concern and our engagement. All right. Fourth myth, and this, in my opinion, is the most pernicious, that somehow the defense of persecuted Christians is either a left-wing or a right-wing crusade, that it's ideological, that it's a political question. I would submit this is fallacious for three reasons. One, it demeans and cheapens the witness of the people I've been trying to describe to suggest that there might be some legitimate political reason for being indifferent to their suffering. Second, it leads to a tremendously reductive and partial and incomplete view of the whole picture. I mean, for example, the political left in the United States can often get very excited about talking about perceived Israeli harassment of Palestinian Christians because, of course, that makes Israel look bad. They're often silent, however, about what's happening to Christians in the Gaza Strip at the hands of Hamas. Meanwhile, the political right in the United States will play up every perceived Muslim atrocity, but they're often silent about the heroic witness of the Catholic martyrs of El Salvador, who stood up to a police state that the American right supported because it was seen as a bulwark against the exportation of communism into Latin America. Okay. My point, ladies and gentlemen, is this. If we are going to take a clear-eyed look at the global war on Christians, we cannot try to see it through the funhouse mirror of secular politics. Final reason why I think this myth has to be debunked is because, quite simply, it's inaccurate. I mean, let me be crystal clear. The global war on Christians is an equal opportunity employer. It doesn't care whether you are a liberal or a conservative. And there are plenty of martyrs to go around for all the constituencies on the political landscape. I have pictures of two individuals here that I think make the point. On this side of the slide, you see Bishop Han Jinjiang. Died in a communist prison in China in 2007. Bishop Han was ordained in 1989. As I say, he died in 2007. During the 18 years of his ministry, he was arrested 11 separate times, came out of the underground church in China. The last time he was arrested was in 1999, so he spent the subsequent 8 years in a prison. Died under what are still mysterious, murky circumstances in 2007. So you could think of Bishop Han as a martyr to communism, if you like. On the other side of the slide, we have the great American martyr of the Amazon, Sister Dorothy Stang. Died in Brazil in 2005. Sister Dorothy was a member of the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, lived in Brazil for about 30 years, passionate advocate for social justice, particularly the rights of indigenous persons in the Amazon region, and particularly their land use rights. For her trouble, she was targeted by the giant agribusiness corporations that dominate the landscape there and the local rancheros who are their henchmen and their allies. So in 2005, she was walking an isolated path from one village to another in the Amazon. 4 gunmen set upon her, pulled their weapons, asked her if she was carrying a weapon. Out of her simple leather satchel, she produced her Bible and said, "This is the only weapon I've got," and then proceeded to read to them from the Beatitudes. They shot her 7 times, left her body on the road. And by the way, the details I'm giving you are not from some kind of imaginary hagiography. This is directly from the transcripts of the court testimony, because one of these guys was later arrested and confessed his role in the crime and described the scene. Okay? So if you like, you could think of Dorothy Stang as a martyr to capitalism. So here we have a martyr to communism, a martyr to capitalism. What point am I trying to make? I don't care if you're a liberal or a conservative, if you're square or round. I don't care where you are on the ideological spectrum. Okay? There are plenty of heroes for you to celebrate. Okay? My point, this is not a left-wing or right-wing issue. Ladies and gentlemen, the global war on Christians is a human issue, and it deserves to be engaged at that level. Okay? Final myth, that there's something wrong with a specific focus on Christians. And you will often hear this when the question of trying to defend persecuted Christians arises. People who are profoundly concerned with peace and with social justice will often argue, look, we shouldn't have a parochial focus specifically on Christians. We should be concerned with everyone. We should be concerned with whoever's rights are being violated. And of course that's right. I mean, as people of faith, Paul VI said the Catholic Church is supposed to be the sacrament of the unity of the human family. Obviously, whenever some member of the human family is suffering, that needs to be our cause too. But I would nevertheless submit that it is entirely legitimate for us to have a preferential option for Christians today. In the same way we had a preferential option for Soviet Jews in the 60s and 70s, the same way we had a preferential option for the black victims of apartheid in the 1980s, because they were the targets of the most grotesque violations of human rights in that era, just as Christians are today the targets of the most grotesque violations of human rights in our time. Okay? All right. What can we do about all of this? The sort of $64,000 practical American question, right? What can we do? This is, again, not intended to be an exhaustive list, but just to toss out some ideas. First, and most obviously, prayer. And aside from the spiritual and supernatural fruits of prayer, the graces that might flow from it, I think we cannot underestimate how important the practice of prayer on behalf of persecuted Christians can be in shaping a culture in the church. Some of you in this room are probably old enough to remember that before Vatican II, we would always pray for the suffering church in Russia at Mass, right? Okay? And, we would pray for the conversion of Russia, which, frankly, was a little anti-ecumenical. I mean, Russia was for centuries a profoundly Christian nation, and 70 years of Soviet domination didn't wipe that out. But nevertheless, it had an effect in lifting up the Church of the Catacombs behind the Iron Curtain in our imagination. And prayer on behalf of persecuted and suffering Christians today can have the same effect. I think the liturgy we celebrated tonight is a beautiful example of the point. Okay. Second, at a very raw level, we can just expand our, as American Catholics in particular I'm talking to now, we can expand our consciousness about the church. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but in my experience, the typical American Catholic, left, right, or center, when they talk about the bishops, they're really talking about the American bishops. When they talk about the church, they're really talking about the American church. And when they talk about the laity, they're really talking about American laity, and on and on. Ladies and gentlemen, here are the realities of the Catholic Church in the early 21st century. There are 1.2 billion baptized Catholics in the world, and there are 65 million Catholics in the United States. What that means is that we American Catholics are exactly 6% of the global Catholic population. 6%. Put another way, in important respects, 94% of the Catholics in the world aren't like us. Bottom line, if it ever was adequate to try to see the church exclusively through the prism of American experiences, American priorities, and American concerns, trying to do that is certainly inadequate to the realities of our time. It just doesn't do justice to who we are. I think that's a second productive step we can take, is expand our consciousness about what the realities of the church in our time actually are. Okay, third, direct political advocacy. And here, we heard Tom Farr, I think this morning, lay out a compelling vision of what a robust defense of religious freedom would look like as a cornerstone of American foreign policy. And to that, all I can say is amen. Think about this, ladies and gentlemen. Mercifully, finally, as a grace from a God who loves us, the election is going to be over tomorrow. Okay? A staggering $6 billion, that's the estimate, $6 billion has been spent on this election. Now, I don't know how closely you followed all the political discourse, but I ask you, has this question of suffering Christians had much traction? Has that $6 billion produced an intelligent conversation about what a robust defense of religious freedom internationally would look like? I would submit to you it hasn't. There's something impoverished about political conversation in this country. We Catholics ought to play a leading role in breaking through that. Direct humanitarian assistance, this again is a no-brainer, and if you're fishing around for a concrete example, by the way, let me tell you, the Catholic Near East Welfare Association, which is pontifically sponsored and it's the largest provider of aid to Christians in Syria, has launched an emergency appeal to try to deliver winter survival kits to 2,000 vulnerable Syrian Christian families. They cost $210 a piece. You can find, if you Google Syria Christians winter survival, you can find all the information online. I'm not here to give you a sales pitch on behalf of Kanewa, but I'm telling you there are concrete steps like that out there where individual people can make decisions that make a difference. We can certainly help with resettling Christian refugees, although, as we were reminded this morning, we have to be careful that in our generosity about making it easier for people to abandon their churches of birth, we don't end up aiding and abetting the unraveling of those churches. It's a real pastoral dilemma. And I think the solution is we have to make it clear for Christians, for example, who are fleeing Syria today, we have to make it clear that we will stand with them now in helping them settle someplace, and we will also be with them 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now if situations change and they want to go home. In other words, we're not simply going to help them get out, we are also going to help them get back if they make that choice. Okay? And finally, we can build north-south partnerships to try to aid local churches and reassure them that they're not alone. I know that may sound like hollow rhetoric, but let me tell you, I was in Beirut September 14th through the 16th for Pope Benedict's trip to Lebanon. There was a sizable group of refugees, Christian refugees from Syria, who came to his open-air mass on the Beirut waterfront that Sunday. By the way, they had left Syria having no idea if they could ever get back. I mean, it wasn't like they chartered a bus and were staying in the Sheraton for 3 days and then were going home, okay, to catch the Knicks on cable or something. I mean, border crossings in Syria right now are incredibly complicated. They packed bags with complete uncertainty about what the future might hold for them, but it was so important to be in the Pope's presence that they were willing to roll the dice. And anyway, I had a chance to spend some time with them, and we were talking about the situation and so forth. And then at the end, I asked, what can we do? Though, I mean, those of us who live in the West, in the States, what can we do for you? And you want to know the number one most popular answer by far that they gave me? The thing that they said that would make the most tangible and appreciable difference to them? The answer was, don't forget about us. Don't forget about us. They have a profound sense of being isolated and alone and forgotten. And even, look, you and I cannot solve the problems of the world. We can't make the violence in Syria go away tomorrow, but we can find creative ways to broadcast the message that we have not forgotten and that we are paying attention. And please do not underestimate how psychologically and spiritually consoling that can be for people who find themselves in harm's way. Okay? Now, I know I'm already taxed your generosity, but I have one last point I would like to make before we finish. On this question of what can we do? Because I think all of these things are compelling and urgent, and we should be doing them all. But I think there is one other bit of business we're going to have to deal with if we are actually going to mount a creative and effective response to this dramatic story that we've been trying to tell. Because I think to put a dent in the problem of the global war on Christians, we are going to have to mount a unified Catholic witness, drawing on the best and brightest in all the different camps in our church. Tom Farr this morning said another thing that stuck with me. He said that the right way to think about a problem is to begin by telling the truth and work your way out from there. So let me tell you a bit of truth about American Catholicism in the early 21st century. For all of our riches, for all of our vitality, for all of our dynamism, we are in many ways a house divided against itself. Now, and this is no secret to anyone in this room. We conventionally talk about the American Catholic Church as if it's polarized, right? As if everyone is clustered either into left or right. I actually think that's profoundly misleading. I think the sociological reality for what we are is that we are tribalized. Because if you take a clear-eyed look at the American Catholic landscape, that's what you're going to see, multiple tribes. We've got neocon Catholics, and we got Church Reformed Catholics, and we got liturgical traditionalist Catholics, and we got the movements, and on and on and on. And look, I mean, in principle, all of these things are precious pieces of the Catholic mosaic. But when it becomes dysfunctional, of course, is when these different tribes stop communicating with one another and start treating one another as ideological and theological enemies. And if we're honest with ourselves, I think we would have to acknowledge that too often that is our situation. So if we are going to effectively come to the defense of our suffering sisters and brothers around the world, the first thing I think we need to do is get our own act together We need to build zones of friendship across these tribal lines so we can harness our collective resources. And if you'll stick with me, I want to tell you one last story to drive this point home, and then I promise you we're done. Okay. Story is this. I grew up in rural western Kansas. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever been to rural western Kansas, and honestly, I can think of no reason on God's earth why you should have been. But if you ever have been, you would know it is not exactly a thriving crossroads of the tourist industry. Okay? The only time we get any out-of-town visitors at all where I grew up is in the fall. It's basically right now because this is pheasant hunting season. Y'all know what a pheasant is, a little game bird, kind of like a turkey. And there's a certain kind of guy, and yes, they are almost always guys, who finds the idea of smearing face paint and wearing combat fatigues and blasting shotguns in the sky over the course of a weekend to be a real hoot. Now, usually this is done while consuming astronomical quantities of beer, so they're always a far greater threat to one another than they are to the pheasants. But nevertheless, these guys show up. Just to give you a sense of the cultural milieu I'm trying to describe, my grandparents lived all of their lives in a tiny western Kansas hamlet called Hill City. Now, it is my candidate for the worst place name in America because there is no hill and there sure as hell is no city. Okay? I'm talking like 500 people on a good day. All right? Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have traveled pretty far and wide in this world of ours. I took 50 trips with John Paul II. I've taken 19 of Benedict XVI's 22 foreign trips. I have stayed in some pretty funky lodgings around the world. But I am here to tell you, the one 11-room motel in Hill City, America, is the only place I have ever stayed where there is a laminated sign in the bathroom that reads, "Please do not gut your birds in the sink." Okay? I am not making this up. The first time I took my wife there, she looked at it and she said, "Is this some kind of weird sexual double entendre?" I had to explain, "No, honey, this is face value stuff, you know?" Anyway, this story is set on one weekend during pheasant hunting season. We've got an out-of-town guy, let's call him a lawyer from New York, who has come out to Graham County to try to bag himself a bird. He spent a long and frustrating weekend with no success. But before he leaves, he decides he's going to take one last shot. So he sees a pheasant moving across the skyline. He shoulders his shotgun. He fires, and miracle of miracles, he brings down the bird. Okay? So now, flushed with triumph, he sets across the field to pick up his trophy. But just as he gets to the spot where the bird has fallen, he comes across a barbed wire fence that is clearly labeled "Private Property Keep Out." Okay? But, of course, he's invested way too much time and effort at this stage, so he starts to climb the fence. Just as he does so, the western Kansas farmer pulls up on his tractor and yells at him, "Hey, buddy, what are you doing?" And the lawyer says, "Well, that's my pheasant. I'm going to pick it up." The farmer says, "No, you're not. That bird landed on my property. It belongs to me." Now, the lawyer, of course, is hot and tired, and he's in a hurry. He just erupts. He says, "Look, you don't understand. I am a senior partner in a top 10 law firm in New York, and if you don't let me have that bird, I'm going to sue you back to the Stone Age." Not realizing this is pretty much where the farmer already lives. Okay. So the farmer looks at him and smiles and says, "Well, that may be how you do things where you come from. But around here, we got a little something called the 3-kick rule." He says, "3-kick rule, what's that about?" Farmer says, "It's simple. I kick you 3 times, then you kick me 3 times. We keep going. Eventually, whoever gives up loses the bird." Okay? And the lawyer thinks that's probably cheaper than a lawsuit. Plus, this guy looks like, he's 180 years old. I mean, I can probably take him. He says, "All right, let's do it." So they line up against one another. Farmer asks, "Are you ready?" The lawyer says yes. Now, the farmer, you understand, is wearing these heavy, mud-clawed western Kansas work boots, right? So he gives him one shot in the shins. The guy screams in pain. He gives him another shot in the midsection. His howls of agony can be heard to the Nebraska border. One last shot into the chin. At this stage, the lawyer is barely conscious. He's seeing stars. But finally, with his last best ounce of effort, he drags himself to his feet, dusts himself off, puts this look of grim determination on his face, okay? Stares the farmer dead in the eye and says, "All right, you old coot, now it's my turn." And the farmer looks at him and smiles and says, "Nah, it's all right. I give up. You can have the bird." This is how we roll, Western Kansas style, ladies and gentlemen. My sisters and brothers in the faith, the foregoing has been a parable. And here's the teaching point of the parable. I would submit to you that too often our internal conversation in the Catholic Church boils down to a kind of ecclesiastical version of the three-kick rule. That is, too often on those rare occasions when members of one Catholic tribe rub shoulders with another, they are not really interested in a patient search for understanding. They are instead looking to score rhetorical cheap shots against people they perceive to be their enemies. Now, under any set of circumstances, that would be aesthetically repugnant. It would be ugly. And those of you who know your von Balthasar know there's a theological insight there. If something is distant from beauty, it is probably also distant from truth. Under any set of circumstances, this tribalized war of all against all would be impossible to reconcile with the ecclesiology of communion, the vision of the church as a community of communities, to which both John Paul II and Benedict XVI have repeatedly called us. But in this brave new world I've been trying to describe to you, in which legions of our co-religionists are paying for their fidelity to the gospel with their blood every year, this sort of petty internal tribal conflict is quite simply unsustainable and inexcusable. And so if I can leave you with one final thought here tonight, and this is really more than a thought, this is what the Italians would call a fervorino, it's a plea, if you like. It is this. I want to invite you to think of yourselves as the architects and the artisans and the engineers of these zones of friendship across the tribal lines in your own spheres of influence, in your schools, in your parishes, in your academic departments, in your workplaces, among your own networks of friends. Be the people who make these zones of friendship come alive, because I guarantee you if we don't do it collectively, it is quite simply not going to be done. And doing this, trying to get our own act in order so that we can mount a unified Catholic response to the pressing challenges of our time, it's not only worth doing for its own sake, because of its own internal importance, because it's a test of our fidelity to who we say we are as a communion of saints. Don't do it just for that reason. Do it also because the blood of the martyrs, the blood of those 100 to 150,000 Christians who are being killed every year, someone on this planet, do it because the 11 Christians who have lost their lives during the course of the last hour, do it because their blood demands it of us. Okay? And I have great confidence that together we can get it done. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. God bless you. God bless the University of Notre Dame. Go Irish! We're doing questions? Okay, we've got some time for questions. Let me preface this with an invitation and a warning. Okay? The invitation is you're welcome to ask anything you like about the presentation you just heard, but don't feel restricted to that. If there's some other issue that you think needs to be put on the table to round out this conversation or whatever, I mean, this is your time, not mine, so feel free to take this conversation any way you want it. I may not know the answer to your question, but ladies and gentlemen, part of the time I work in American TV. Absolute ignorance has never been a bar to talking about something before. I see no reason why I should be here tonight. Okay? The warning is that the good people here at Notre Dame are paying me to stand here for the next few minutes, whether you all have questions or not. So if you don't come up with questions, I am simply going to subject you to additional Pope chokes. And I promise you this is not a consummation devoutly to be wished. So what do you have? You don't necessarily need to go to the mic if you don't want to. You can just raise your hand, and I'll repeat your question so everyone hears it. Yes, Father. The voice from India.
Yeah, thank you, John. You are simply brilliant and not merely challenging, but I think you have set the tone definitely for me and for all of us to have a united Catholic witness.
Father, you have excellent taste in oratory. Congratulations.
Yeah. Now, what I would like to flag out just one point, the point you mentioned about Hindu radicalism. Many people say in the West do not understand this and what is happening in India. I'll be speaking more about it tomorrow. But a lot of Hindu radicalism, which is taking place in India, is supported from the United States, in case people do not know. Modi, the one who is posturing himself to be the Prime Minister of India and has been denied, thanks to people like Thomas Fard and the others of the State Department at that time in 2002, 2003. Nina Shea and the US CIRF and all played a great role in denying him a visa. But there are today guys like Joe Walsh here, Chicago 8th District. I met him in Congress a couple of months ago, is all for Modi, or he's a Tea Party guy. And once you posture a man like that as a possible Prime Minister of India, is not merely dangerous for the Christians in India, but dangerous for the subcontinent and for the whole world. So I would like to flag out just one point to tell those who are here in America, just beware of Hindu radicalism, as you yourself have said. But more important than that, a lot of it comes from a lot of support, with groups like APCO Worldwide, some of the Tea Party guys and so on here, which I think is extremely dangerous. But thank you for your sharing.
Thank you, Father. Any one of these issues that I ticked off, whether we're talking about the threats of Islamic radicalism, Hindu radicalism, corporate interests, whatever, they're all infinitely more complex than I had time to make them sound. What I'm trying to accomplish, and I should say this presentation is one that I try to give every opportunity that I get. What I'm trying to accomplish with this is not so much answer every one of the questions that might be asked about the global war on Christians. I'm trying to puncture that threshold illiteracy that there is a global war on Christians to begin with, right? And what I hope is that what people will take away from this isn't necessarily answers, but a hunger to find those answers. And certainly, particularly when it comes to India, you were one of the people that from now on I will direct them to. So thank you.
Jerry Powers, I'm here at Notre Dame, but I was at the USCCB working on religious liberty for about 17 years. And it was terrific talk. You do what we were trying to do, and you do it much better in some ways. But let me take you on for a second on your one point about the preferential option for Christians. And as a Catholic community, that makes sense to a great extent. I remember once asking the head of Human Rights Watch why they didn't pay more attention to religious liberty, and he said, well, that's because you religious communities can do that. And that's true. If you're not standing up for your own people, no one else will. But if you are only standing up for your own people, or if you are perceived to be only standing up for your own people, then you're going to be less effective in doing so, and you're also going to impoverish the kind of Christian witness that we want to have for this foundational right of religious freedom. So you have to stand up for everyone's right to religious freedom, not your own. The more important point is the public policy point that I think you implied by reference to Jackson Vanik and the apartheid situation, that as a matter of public policy, we should be adopting a preferential option for Christians. Was that correct, or am I misunderstanding?
Well, I would certainly echo the call for a preferential option as a matter of public policy, but I was really more talking about us as a Catholic community in the States.
Okay. Because I would say Jackson Vanik was a necessary policy in the sense that it focused on Soviet Jewry, but it was a bad public policy because it almost exclusively focused U.S. human rights policy on Soviet Jewry, which was more a reflection of the peculiar political dynamics in the U.S. than the situation of human rights in the Soviet Union at the time. Witnessed the millions of persecuted Christians at the time who were largely ignored by U.S. policy. And the second example is the Wolf legislation, which got the ball rolling on religious freedom in the late 1990s. That original piece of legislation was dead on arrival for one reason, because it focused exclusively on persecution of Christians. And the reason that you finally had a bill that passed Congress was because, with the support of the U.S. bishops and many others, expanded to include all those who were persecuted, regardless of their religion. And that's why we have a new office on religious freedom at the State Department. That's why we have the International Commission on International Religious Freedom. We wouldn't have had either of those if the Wolf legislation had not changed, and it's continued to focus only on Christians. So,
thank you. Among other things, ladies and gentlemen, let this be a lesson to you. Always be cautious about accepting invitations to speak to a room full of experts, okay? Because they're always, invariably, going to know way more than you do. Listen, I appreciate your unpacking this, because they are cautionary tales, in a way, about how we frame this advocacy. When I talk about a preferential option for suffering Christians, I don't mean to the exclusion of concern for others. But I mean, let's not be hesitant, let's not be bashful about talking about the reality of anti-Christian persecution out of a sense that somehow doing that makes us parochial, makes us limited, makes us, insular. Because first of all, I think we have to tell the truth about what's actually unfolding in the world, and what's actually unfolding in the world is that, statistically speaking, Christians are taking it to a degree that other religious communities right now are not. That's an empirical reality of our times. But secondly, I would say that if we genuinely develop an apparatus to effectively engage, come to the defense of suffering Christians, then naturally we are going to be more effective at coming to the defense of other suffering populations as well. I mean, in other words, far from being opposed, I think these two things are linked, right? At least that would be my hope. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you also for your talk. The statistics that you gave for how many Christians die annually as victims of persecution, some of those statistics are gathered, am I correct, through the United Nations fact-finding? No?
Well, I mean, you can rely on UN data, but the UN does not specifically track how many Christians are being killed around the world every year.
Okay. I was wondering, you commented that this was not a part of the conversation for this current election season here in the United States. Does it ever come up at the UN?
Yes. I mean, for example, the Holy See, of course, has observer status at the UN, and the Holy See's permanent representative has raised this question. It has come up more recently at the European Parliament, of all places. There is actually a push in the European Parliament to create an observancy to monitor anti-Christian persecution around the world. My own read would be that there is a growing consciousness around this question that is not limited specifically to Catholic conversation, but I think it is also beginning in sort of fits and starts to penetrate secular political conversation in some places. And usually it's because somebody has tripped across this in their own life. I mean, the guy, for example, who is pioneering the creation of the observancy in the European Parliament, his wife has a cousin who was killed in Iraq. I mean, a Chaldean Christian, Orthodox Christian, who was killed in Iraq, and that converted him to this issue. I mean, I'll tell you, we've been talking all day about the spiritual power of the witness of the martyrs. It's real. If you've been touched by it in some way, it stays with you. I was telling Dan before we fired up here tonight that for me, I can date to the day and time, the moment when I was converted to this issue. It was June 27th, 2001. It was in Ukraine. It was John Paul II's trip to Ukraine. Of course, the apple of John Paul's eye was always a trip to Russia, but it was by that stage obvious he was never going to make it, and Ukraine was as close as he was ever going to get. It was the first former Soviet republic that he'd been able to visit after the fall of the wall. And I don't know how much I know some of you are much better versed in this than I am, but if you don't know, the Greek Catholic Church in the Ukraine, which is one of the 22 Eastern Rite churches in union with Rome, it was the largest illegal religious body in the world during the Soviet era, the largest underground church in the world. And in percentage terms, they generated more martyrs under the Soviets than anybody else. I mean, the Russian Orthodox had much higher raw numbers, but in terms of a percentage of the religious community, the Greek Catholic Church was the most martyred church of the 20th century. Okay? And so obviously John Paul being there had special power. Now, I didn't know any of that before I got there. Okay? I remember John Paul's, the final item in his itinerary was he did a big open-air mass in Lviv, which is in eastern Ukraine, what they once upon a time called Galicia, which is where the Greek Catholics are concentrated. Okay? And it was in this airfield. Okay? 2 million people showed up in this airfield for the papal mass. And it had been raining all night, okay, and into the next day. Okay? Now, me being stupid American reporter that morning, I had brought my laptop and my BlackBerry and my trip book and a 1,000-page tome on the history of the Greek Catholic Church. Of course, the one thing that I didn't think to bring that might have been useful was an umbrella. And so what I did was I was getting soaked, and so I started walking towards the back of the mass site because they had set up, the Ukrainians, the religious events there are huge deals for them. They had set up a kind of open-air bazaar at the back of the mass, okay, where you could buy pretty much any product you wanted. I mean, I kid you not, I could have had my tires rotated that day. I could have bought a washer and dryer. I'm not making this up. I saw it all, okay? The one thing, of course, they were completely out of was umbrellas. So finally, a Ukrainian cop took pity on me and gave me a kind of blue poncho to put on. So now I'm trying to make my way through this crowd of 2 million people back to the press tent, right? And out of the corner of my eye, I catch this young, she couldn't have been any more than 23 or 24, young girl off by herself, on her knees, in the mud, weeping. Okay? And I didn't want to intrude. I didn't want to violate her privacy, but I couldn't help being curious, so I kind of waited for her to compose herself. And then I walked up and asked if she spoke any either English or Italian, and like most young Ukrainians these days, she had some English. So I asked her, can you just tell me, obviously something has really touched you. Can you tell me what's going on? And she explained that her grandfather had been a Greek Catholic priest. Of course, as you know, in the Greek Catholic tradition, the parish clergy are married. So her grandfather had been a Greek Catholic priest. He was arrested during the Soviet era, sent to the gulags, given the same choice that most of these guys were, which is they could either convert to Orthodoxy or they could be killed. Okay. He refused to convert, so the death sentence was passed. And the particular way they decided to kill this guy is they crucified him upside down on the prison wall. And bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, this is not 1,800 years ago. This is not Felicity and Perpetua. Okay, this is 50 years ago we're talking about. Okay. So this girl was telling me this story. And she said, the reason I'm crying is because I'm imagining what must be in my grandfather's heart today, looking down from heaven and seeing the Holy Father stand on Ukrainian soil. Now look, I told you, I grew up in western Kansas in the 70s, okay? My idea of suffering for the faith was eating fish sticks and mac and cheese on Friday. That's as close to martyrdom as I ever got, okay? What that moment did for me, and I mean, it's one thing to read about this or have some notional understanding of it, but it's another thing to have direct contact with the testimony. What that moment brought home to me with the kind of power that I could never have expected was that quite apart from all of the heartache that we experience in Catholic life, okay, the politics and the humanity and the crisis and the scandal and the frustrations that all of us at one point or another feel with the church, quite apart from all of that, there is something so precious about this faith that ordinary people, when pushed to the wall, will pay in blood rather than let go of it. I can't tell you how many times over the last 10 years when I've been tempted to despair or frustration or throwing in the towel, that memory has come back to me. I mean, really, this is a case in which the martyrs of Ukraine sustained me. I was very grateful. 2 weeks ago, I was in Lviv again. I was giving a lecture at the Catholic University there, and I had the opportunity finally to say thank you. But I think ultimately, I guess this is the point I'm trying to make, that the testimony of the martyrs has a kind of evocative spiritual power that I don't think anything else in Christian experience really parallels. And that's why I say this problem of tribalism I was discussing. I mean, I think this sort of solidarity with the martyrs is important not only for its own right, but because I think it has enormous promise to move us past this tribalism. Because, I mean, let's face it, folks, if we can't all come together around this issue, I mean, what hope is there for us? To put it differently, I think this issue, there is an ecumenism of the gulags, an ecumenism of the martyrs, that works not just in the relationship between Catholics and Orthodox or Catholics and Protestants, it also works in the relationship among Catholics inside our own house. And I'd like to see that power unleashed. We done?
Yeah, friends,
wait. I know the hook is out. Let me say one more thing. I want this to be the beginning of a conversation among us and not the end, okay? I don't just want to parachute out of here and have no further contact. So let me say this. If there is any way I can ever be of help to anyone in this room, now I don't have any real idea of what that might be, but if you're in a faith group in a parish and this issue comes up and you're looking for resources, or you're in a class and you're looking for someone you can connect with in the Syrian church, for example, who might be able to give you a read on local whatever it is. I mean, for God's sake, ladies and gentlemen, if you're coming to Rome and you want restaurant recommendations, okay, this is where I truly shine, by the way. Whatever it is, okay, if I can be of help to you, I have an online column that's called All Things Catholic. If you just Google All Things Catholic John Allen, it'll bring it up. My email address is at the bottom, okay? So you can get in touch with me that way. Now, please, in the subject line, put something like, Seed of the Church Conference or something, So I don't think you're the 8th Nigerian prince today who's going to give me 30 million bucks if I just give you my bank account details. But assuming you penetrate my spam filter, okay, if I can be of help, I would be delighted to do that. And listen, it would not be an imposition. Okay, if I'm going to run around talking about the need to build zones of friendship, then obviously I need to walk my own talk. Okay? So if I can be of help to you, it would not be a burden. It would be an opportunity for me to feel like a person of integrity. Okay? So please take advantage of that. Again, thank you. Thank you to John Cavadini. Thank you to everybody who's been taking part of this conference. Andiamo.